The Supreme Court did not attack America on the 20th of February 2026. It did something far more basic and far more dangerous to the MAGA business model. It enforced the premise that we are not a monarchy. In Learning Resources Incorporated, Trump, the court held that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize a president to impose tariffs. In other words, tariffs are taxes, and taxes belong to Congress. That is not a radical idea. That is the separation of powers in its original packaging. And yet, watching the Trump administration's response, you can almost see the panic beneath the bluster. Because this ruling did not just take away a policy lever, it took away a performative lever. For Trump, tariffs aren't primarily about economic strategy, they're about dominance. They're a remote control he likes to hold up for the cameras to prove he can shock the entire global economy on command, without negotiating, without persuading, without legislating, without even pretending to do the work that democratic governance requires. When the court said, no, you don't get that, the reaction wasn't thoughtful recalibration. It was the political equivalent of flipping the table and insisting you still won the game. That's why the so-called fatal error here is not just the policy substance, it's the tell. It's the confession embedded in the tantrum. The administration's first instinct after losing wasn't to go to Congress and make the case, because making the case would require something Trump can't supply: evidence, coalition, patience, competence. Instead, it sprinted toward a workaround, dusting off Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a rarely used authority that allows a temporary import surcharge in specific circumstances capped at 15% and limited to 150 days. Reuters reports that Trump first pivoted to a 10% global tariff using Section 122, then within a day announced he'd raise it to 15%. Think about what that sequence reveals. If tariffs were truly about carefully rebuilding American manufacturing, you would not be whipping them out like party favors on a legal deadline. If tariffs were truly about long-term investment, you would not be relying on a statute that runs out in 150 days. A factory does not appear because a president got mad on cable news. Capital investment doesn't move on vibes. Supply chains don't rewire themselves because Trump needs a new headline to drown out the last one. The 150-day limit is not a detail, it is the entire story. A time-limited, emergency-style surcharge is functionally useless for the two justifications Trump sells to his base. It doesn't produce credible bargaining leverage because every foreign leader with a calendar can wait you out. It doesn't incentivize onshoring at scale because no serious firm is pouring concrete for a multi-year project based on a tariff that might vanish before the permits are even approved. In practical terms, what it does best is the one thing tariffs always do reliably. It functions as a tax that ripples through prices and uncertainty. And in February 2026, with households already tense about affordability, that choice is not strength. It's deliberate economic recklessness packaged as patriotism. That is why the administration's messaging has gotten so weird so fast. You can hear the gears grinding in real time. If we can't justify tariffs as lawful under IEEPA, we'll justify them as temporary under Section 122. If the public notices that temporary tariffs can't deliver the promised manufacturing renaissance, we'll rebrand the entire project as leverage for trade deals. If those deals are shaky or amorphous or aspirational, we'll insist the very act of questioning them is un-American. This is also why Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's TV comments matter so much. The transcript you provided captures the administration's escalation impulse in plain English. When confronted with a Supreme Court loss, Bessent did not describe a plan to work with Congress. He gestured at harsher tools, including the idea of a complete embargo, presenting it as some kind of draconian alternative to keep other countries in line. That's not an economics argument. It's a threat posture. It's governance by intimidation, not by lawmaking. It's what happens when an administration has trained itself to tray an enemy rather than a boundary. And here's the deeper constitutional rot. Notice how quickly the administration slides from tariffs are our lawful emergency tool to, well, we have other emergency tools and we'll use them. That's the Trump era pattern. The details change, but the direction does not. The presidency is supposed to be an office with enumerated powers. The MAGA presidency is treated like a roaming permission slip. If you can't get what you want through one statute, you rummage around for another, then threaten something even more extreme, until the other side, Congress, courts, foreign leaders, domestic critics decides compliance is less exhausting than resistance. The Supreme Court ruling disrupts that strategy in a way the administration cannot admit out loud. Because what the court said, in essence, is that you cannot derive an unlimited taxing power from a national emergency statute. Chief Justice Roberts' majority opinion, as summarized by outlets covering the decision, rejects the idea that a couple of words in IEEPA can be stretched into the authority to impose tariffs on imports from any country of any product at any rate for any amount of time. That's the language of a court telling a president, stop pretending you found a cheat code in the US code. The Constitution is not a terms of service you can scroll past. So what does Trump do? He goes looking for a different cheat code. Section 122 becomes the new toy. And in a perfect encapsulation of how unserious this is, the rate jumps from 10% to 15% almost immediately, because this is not a calibrated policy instrument. This is a grievance instrument. This is a response to humiliation. Meanwhile, the administration is staring down another problem it doesn't want to solve: refunds. Businesses have been pressing for repayment of tariffs already collected under the now invalidated scheme, and reporting has put large numbers into the public conversation about what could be owed back and what a messy process might look like. The transcript you shared shows the rhetorical move that follows. Call the ruling discombobulated, insist the courts gave no guidance, and hint that refunds can be litigated into oblivion. The point is delay. Delay is power. If you can't win on authority, you try to win on attrition. This is where the fatal error becomes political, not just legal. Trump's team is behaving as if the Supreme Court's ruling is a temporary obstacle they can route around by escalating. But the ruling changes the terrain. It tells every business paying these tariffs, every trade lawyer preparing the next suit, every judge watch a statutory improvisation, and every foreign government negotiating under duress that the White House is not the final word. That is not an abstraction. It's a signal that Trump's leverage is not as absolute as he sells it, and it invites a very rational response. Stall, litigate, wait, hedge, diversify away from U.S. volatility, and treat America's trade posture as a political weather system rather than a dependable rule of law. Even the pro-business right should understand what that does to the American brand. When policy becomes a personal tantrum, the U.S. stops being a stable anchor and starts being a risk premium. And once other countries learn to route around American instability, they don't snap back overnight just because a future administration behaves like adults. That damage is generational. There's also the spectacle component, which is never accidental with Trump. Reporting following the ruling described Trump lashing out at the justices and escalating rhetoric even when the legal loss was clear. That is part of the MAGA instruction manual. If an institution limits you, the institution must be discredited, because the entire project depends on persuading the public that no referee is legitimate unless it declares Trump the winner. And it's in that context that the court's decision becomes bigger than tariffs. This case is about whether Congress still matters. It's about whether the tax power still belongs to the people's branch, or whether we're going to let a president unilaterally impose sweeping taxes by shouting emergency into the microphone. The court, in this instance, refused to pretend. Now, if you're waiting for Republicans in Congress to defend their own authority, I have some beachfront property in Arizona to sell you. Trump's modern Republican Party is built on surrendering institutional prerogatives to one man as long as he hurts the right targets. They'll complain about executive overreach when a Democrat signs a climate rule, then cheer like trained seals when Trump tries to invent tariff authority out of thin air. The hypocrisy isn't a bug, it's the system. Consistency would require principles, and principles would require limits, and limits are precisely what the MAGA movement treats as treason. So here we are. An administration that lost in court, found a temporary workaround that cannot accomplish what it claims, floated threats that veer toward embargo fantasies, and hinted it may try to slow walk refunds while insisting the American people are the victims of a judiciary doing its job. That's the story. Not that Trump is fighting for workers, not that this is toughness, The story is that the presidency, in Trump's hands, is being treated as an instrument for personal domination, and when the law blocks that domination, the response is not democracy. It is escalation. It is grievance. It is coercion. It is the insistence that if one legal pathway closes, the president is entitled to open another by force of will. The Supreme Court did not solve America's problems on the 20th of February 2026. It did something smaller and more essential. It reminded the country that the president is not supposed to have the power to tax the world because he's angry. The question now is whether the rest of our institutions and the public will act like that reminder matters. Because an administration that responds to a constitutional boundary by shopping for harsher tools is not signaling strength. It is signaling that it cannot tolerate a democracy where power is shared. And if you want the most honest translation of Trump's post-ruling scramble, it's this. The Supreme Court forced him to confront a reality he hates. He can't always get what he wants by decree. So he's trying to turn a legal loss into a political weapon, daring Congress to stop him, daring the courts to chase him, daring the country to accept the idea that law is just an obstacle course for one man's ego. That is the fatal error. Not because it's bad optics, but because it makes the authoritarian impulse unmistakable, in writing, in public, on the record.